Okay, so initially I made a 3-hour video on the writing of Fire Emblem Fates. I got to the point where I was getting ready to finish it in the next couple of days before the universe gave me a present and wiped my whole computer. Merry Christmas. Please like and subscribe to save me from my suffering. God clearly did not want this video to exist. World's smallest violin aside, this time I'm going to be splitting it into more easily digestible parts. During this video, I'm going to be talking very specifically about the characters of Fire Emblem Fates and why I think they generally fail to be engaging or likable. I'm not even gonna bother with a proper intro this time, you know why you're here. I'm just here because Fates is fun to talk about, in case you wanted to know why some loser on the internet is still dogging on this game like a decade after it came out. I think people kind of underrate how much the lack of quality in the cast as a whole negatively affects the experience. The one that gets the vast majority of the hate is understandably Corrin, so let's start there. Corrin is pretty much universally considered to be one of the biggest problems with this game. And considering they're literally the main character, you know, the person you're stuck with by far the most throughout the game, that's kind of a big deal. Fire Emblem has this kind of nasty habit of avatar characters. These are characters that are made intentionally bland for the purpose of being a self-insert. I think self-inserts are kind of inherently trash, with the only real exception within the series for me being Robin, who I, at the very least, found to be less basic than the other newer protagonists. Some people can't really see these characters as a conduit for themselves, and I'm one of those people. So to me, it's one of the worst ways to do a protagonist. If I were to try and describe Corrin's personality, I'd say that they are generically nice and would probably be able to say very little else. In a couple of supports and throwaway dialogue, they're given some very small quirks, like that they're good with animals or terrible at cooking. But this is all window dressing, and quirks are not a replacement for proper personality traits, especially when these pretty much only ever show up in the supports. Corrin's main intended character flaw is that they're extremely naive. This makes sense, they've been locked in a tower their whole life, although the whole tower thing is sort of its own issue. Corrin has no real-life experiences as a result of it. They're essentially a blank slate as opposed to someone that truly feels like they fit in as a part of that setting. They don't know anything about Nor despite having grown up there, and therefore is ill-fitting as a protagonist in a game where a huge part of the story is defined by their attachment to Nor and their adoptive family there. And yes, I know I'm kind of stretching the meaning of the word adopted. Now, Corrin being naive is not an inherent flaw on the game, but the handling of this flaw is. The game almost doesn't know whether it wants to acknowledge this as a flaw or not. It feels really weirdly inconsistent because in one route the game will punish Corrin for this trait and in another they get praised for it. And since this is their only established major flaw, in 2 out of 3 routes everyone loves Corrin and they're not allowed to be called out for anything ever. Which means that in Birthright and Revelation they quite literally are characterized as being perfect and flawless. They make some especially stupid and needlessly risky decisions in Revelation and get congratulated for it. This is not to say that Corrin has weaker writing in any particular route. I think they're all about equal, just bad in different ways. They are actually criticized at several points in Conquest, but it never really commits to it. Whether it be their allies or the plot itself, they are shielded in one way or another from having to truly take responsibility and fix what they've done. They do try to take responsibility in some nebulous way, but not in any way that truly affects their actions. When Corrin does these very irresponsible things that result in tragedy after tragedy, it certainly has an impact on their mental state, but it all kind of feels like it never commits, because of that aforementioned lack of effect on how Corrin acts and develops. Their internal monologue changes, but their actions do not. The plot essentially bars Corrin from the opportunity to grow at all. This part of Corrin in particular I think is less of an issue with Corrin themselves and more to do with the writing of the scenario they're placed in. Whether it be Leo coming to kill stuff for us or enemies just committing die for reasons, the plot always bends around this desire Corrin has to keep their hands clean and enables this naive mindset. As a result, Corrin never changes. They don't get worse and they don't get better, they just stay jarringly stagnant in this weird fucked up purgatorial in-between state where they should be getting development, but it never fully happens. But while I think Conquest Corrin falls too deep into talking about how much they hate what they're doing every 5 minutes and then not actually doing anything about it, Birthright Corrin has the complete opposite problem. Even in Revelation, the route that's supposed to be the golden ending, Corrin still does question themselves at a few points. Not many, but they do exist. But Birthright Corrin never does this. Birthright, Corrin lacks any kind of self-awareness and never stops to reflect on what they're doing, and therefore obviously doesn't develop there either. And before anyone says it, no, I don't think that this is suddenly fine just because you're fighting for the good guys this time around, because in Birthright you still do some very questionable shit, and the game just kinda glosses over it. But Corrin is arguably at their flattest during Birthright. They're almost a non-character here. A common thread in all of these routes, though, is that they are never pushed to change. Fates also just stacks special protagonist abilities onto Corrin like it's trying to play Jenga. Like, I get that they're the main character, but they're royalty for 3 different countries, they're a secret half-dragon demigod and child of the most powerful being on the continent, they're the wielder of the xoxo, they're the chosen one, they are heavily implied to have foresight. To me, all of this says I want to make this character as cool and special as possible, but don't want to put in the effort to make them interesting. Stacking a ton of special, powerful traits onto your characters like this doesn't suddenly make them likable or cool, it just kind of makes them obnoxious. The main issue with this to me is that it just makes Corrin very hard to relate to. Shockingly, most people don't have any real-world experience with being nobility of 3 different countries while being a literal dragon demigod. This is why people love Ike, for example. It's in part because he's just some normal dude and marks one of the very few times in Fire Emblem where you aren't playing as a super important member of royalty. Corrin, then, is about as far in the opposite direction of Ike as you could possibly go. Obviously, not every character has to be just like me for real, but under the wrong circumstances it can lead to the player just feeling kind of alienated and not really invested in what happens. And as well, I thought the whole point of self-inserts was that they're easy to put yourself in their shoes. Corrin failing to be relatable ruins the whole point of their archetype. And all of these abilities or traits are established by the time the route split happens, and Corrin never does anything to earn the powers or respect that result from it. They just get established within like 2 sentences out of nowhere and then they move on. The xoxo for Corrin in particular is typically only brought up after its introduction as another excuse, with characters regularly stating that Corrin must be in the right because they are its wielder. I mentioned before that Corrin is a dragon, and unlike the xoxo, I actually really like the idea of this. Yes, it's partially for superficial reasons, sue me, dragons are cool, but having a half-dragon protagonist would certainly be unique and has potential to be used in an interesting way in the story. It's just kind of a shame that it gets handled the way it does here. After the initial introduction scene for their dragon form, Azura just hands them a dragon stone and it's never brought up again? Leaving aside the obvious question of why or how Azura just has one laying around in her pocket, because I don't think they thought this plot point through at all beyond just saying it's convenient, the fact that Corrin is a literal fucking dragon is never once brought up again in the entire game. You could use it to solve problems, you could use it to create problems. You could have a whole arc where Corrin learns to control it instead of just having it handed to them. You could have it damage Corrin's reputation because people think there's some kind of monster. You could make a point of wanting to answer why, which could lead up to the eventual reveal that, oh shit, oh fuck, Anankos is your dad, but never using it at all feels wasteful. I won't get into too much detail on this particular scene, but just to show you what I mean, there's a scene where Corrin is about to fall into a sinkhole, and Kaze sacrifices himself and dies to save Corrin, even though they could have just transformed and used their wings to fly out. A whole ass playable unit died entirely because the game forgot Corrin was a dragon. The best thing I can say about Corrin is that they are emotionally dynamic, and despite all of my complaining, I found them inoffensive in that I didn't feel irritated every time they showed up to talk, which is more than I can say for a certain someone, but we'll get to him later. I think in many ways, Corrin goes to show that Fates never really got past the throwing around ideas phase. Because a lot of things about Corrin are cool in a vacuum. I still haven't had my wish fulfilled of getting a not shitty dragon protagonist in a Fire Emblem game, and Corrin being royalty to both Hoshido and Nor is the most important aspect of the concept that Fates is built around. And as unoriginal as the whole "the villain is actually your dad" thing tends to be nowadays, it gets used so often for a reason. It's an effective way of adding a little dramatic spice. These are all cool concepts. The issue, then, is that these ideas never complement each other. There's no reason for these traits to all be stacked onto a single character, other than simply because the writers thought the individual ideas were cool. What you get as a result of this is a protagonist that is less than the sum of their parts. Corrin is very far from the only issue this game has with its cast, though. I find the majority of them to be unlikable. At the risk of pissing people off, because I know that a lot of people actually do like her, Azura is hardly a character, at least in the main story. She's supposedly cold and distant towards others, but it doesn't make that particularly clear, because the game still tries to make a point of her immediate bond with Corrin, despite the fact that this doesn't actually make that much sense for her. She is shown to be very distant with her adoptive family, but this just raises more questions, especially when she immediately trusts Corrin upon meeting them way more than her own family. I think her supports are actually a bit better at giving her a real personality, but the supports aren't going to be the majority of what you see unless you're really grinding for it. And hey, maybe it's a bad idea actually to hide your secondary protagonist's entire personality behind side content. Just a suggestion. Her whole shtick is that she's supposed to be this mysterious maiden-type character, but ends up just withholding extremely important information for really dumb reasons. Her backstory is that she's from the lost kingdom of Vala, and after its destruction, her mother Aret and her fled to Noor, where Aret married King Garen, and when Azura is a toddler, Aret spoils the entire plot for her, as well as teaching her the song Lost in Thoughts All Alone, all of which she remembers perfectly years later somehow without needing to be reminded unless it's birthright, after which Aret dies as a direct result due to the Valite curse. People in the Norian castle try to kill her every 5 minutes, and then she gets kidnapped by Hoshidans and raised by their royal family, and people still try to kill her every 5 minutes. I have a few issues with all of this. Her knowing the plot is given the flimsiest justification possible. Maybe I just have dick for memory, but I find it completely unbelievable that she would remember all of that flawlessly after all of that time. Because she knows about Vala, she can't actually say anything, but they never state why she can't literally just write it down, which is a plot hole that gapes so wide it's honestly just kind of funny. She's certainly the character most affected by the Valite curse, largely considered by most people to be one of the worst plot points in Fates. It seems like every aspect of her is bound to it, and she greatly suffers as a result. You could say that this is the fault of the writing as a whole rather than an issue with Azura specifically, but it genuinely becomes difficult to divorce the two concepts when taken to this extreme. Her whole character is defined by it. I want that to sink in, that her whole character is defined solely by something she can never tell us a single word about in both Birthright and Conquest. Her being so coldly indifferent towards any of the Hoshidan royals makes little sense when considering they are literally her adoptive family. It kind of makes most of them look really bad, to be honest, because the main story makes it look like they've lived under the same roof for years and all of them just forget her, and she kind of seems to feel no connection to them, even though she felt an immediate connection to Corrin, so obviously she isn't the main problem here. There's one Hoshidan royal in particular that shows this by far the most, to the point where he throws some deeply upsetting undertones into her entire dynamic with the Hoshidan royal family. But even with that aside, they almost never acknowledge when she's in the room and constantly seem to forget about her. There's so many points in Conquest, for example, where the Hoshidan royals will beg Corrin to come home and not ask Azura to come back too, or even so much as acknowledge her existence, even though she was the one who grew up with them, not Corrin. Much of the time, all of this comes across as simply being the case because they don't actually consider her family. Maybe they say otherwise during the supports. I'll admit I didn't actually unlock that many of them for Azura during Birthright, but I don't think that really matters. Azura is one of the main characters. There is no excuse for this to not be established during the main story. I know that it probably wasn't supposed to come across this way, but it speaks to how bad the game is at communicating this, that you can't tell without going through a shitload of supports. It's extremely odd that she speaks so lowly of how Noor treated her and then says how much she loves Hoshido, even though it is established in supports that she faced regular assassination attempts in Hoshido. This is never established to be any different from how Noor treated her. Other than this just being a really obvious double standard in terms of how the game treats the morality of Noor and Hoshido as countries, it also just comes across like what the game is telling you and what they're showing you are two different things. She tells you that she loves it here and gets treated well, while the game shows her being subject to massive mistreatment by Takumi and mentioning that she gets subject to constant assassination attempts, while the game tries to gloss over it and not address it in any kind of meaningful way. Her seeming indifference towards the Hoshidan royals, of course, really is just a lame excuse for her to follow Corrin regardless of route. Azura kind of comes across much of the time time like they just gave her the most tragic backstory possible and assumed they were done for the day. You can't just pile a series of traumatic events onto a character and expect that to do all of the heavy lifting. They still need a personality, a motivation, something to latch onto. But she is consistently forgettable, bland, and aimless. Much of this may be her lack of agency. She just kinda seems to follow Corin around like a lost puppy for the most part and doesn't really do much independently. The only exceptions I can think of with this is her deciding to perform at Sarkenzia during Conquest, or her taking Corin to Vala at the beginning of Revelation, and that's kind of it. She also doesn't seem like she's really ever affected emotionally by what's happening around her. Perhaps the point of this was to portray someone who's so beaten down by life they no longer care, but there's no growth out of this, no place where she truly finds a reason to care. It's simply accepted as fact. And after a certain point, when she's this blasé about everything, it almost makes you think that if she doesn't care, why should we? It simply isn't compelling because she is so infectiously bored that the audience becomes bored as well. Right, I guess it's time for me to cover Garen then. It is because of this single character that any kind of moral nuance or complexity is thrown out of a 10-story window. Garen is a very one-dimensional villain who does shit like burst into villainous laughter completely unprompted and randomly threatens to execute his children for no reason other than because lol, lamau even. He also has quite literally no motivation for being evil except for the fact that he is secretly a mind-controlled zombie. A big thing that happens a lot in this game is that characters will often turn out to have been possessed by a non-Kos the entire time, who is the actual main villain of the game. As a result of this, Garen doesn't have a character beyond just being a human skid mark. In every scene he shows up in, every line he has, it's always to portray how sadistic he is and nothing else. Even the worst human beings to have ever lived probably had, like, hobbies and moments where they were kind to someone. And just having a crappy one-dimensional villain would be one thing, but Fate's made such a big deal in its concept and promotional material in its difficult choice, trying to decide who's in the right, so having this as one of your options entirely invalidates that choice. Because at the bare minimum, we need to understand why the Norian royals would follow him. It's portrayed as though Xander follows him out of blind loyalty and the others follow him out of fear. It's never out of any true ideological overlap or even bond with the man, even though Garen is supposed to be their father. Have him talk about the famine and poverty in Nor as his motivation for going to war against Hoshido, because whether or not he actually cares about those things, we need to understand why the characters would believe he does. Even if, for me personally, I would much rather they went the full way and made him genuinely morally complicated, because without doing that, it's going to be a lot harder to make fighting for Nor justifiable. I feel like there's a lot of potential motivations they could have gone with, and they just went with none of them. Maybe he genuinely believes these actions will help his country. Maybe he became jaded after the deaths of his wives, or holds some grudge against Hoshido for some previous wrongdoing, which would also be a good way to explore the previous relationship between the two countries, but I digress. He had no reason to be a secret zombie cum monster. And I suppose that means I should talk about the main royal siblings, going generally from oldest to youngest. Ryoma is kind of intended to be this wise, noble leader type of character. He's supposed to value honor above all else. However, his actions don't reflect this. As a result, to me, he comes across as a manipulative asshole. He intentionally keeps very important information from his allies, and although there are other examples, the biggest one that stands out to me is how he acts regarding Corin not actually being related to him. Ignoring for right now the multitude of ways in which this plot point completely goes against everything Birthright is trying to accomplish, what is relevant right now is the fact that, unlike the rest of the siblings, Ryoma knew this throughout the entirety of the story. He's always the one in the beginning of the story trying to get Corin to join him explicitly on the basis that he's Corin's blood family, but when he reveals this, which he will only ever do if he supports Corin, nobody acknowledges the fact that he's been outright lying to you the entire time, and the only time he tells the truth is so that he can fuck his stepsister. And everybody is just cool with it. Another example of this is during the chapter in Conquest where you have to get medicine to save Elise, where he holds Elise's life for ransom to get Corin to defect to Hoshido, despite the fact that Elise is a 14-year-old girl who can't even fight back because she's canonically your healer. He's clearly intended to be this honorable warrior, but his actions in the story couldn't tell a more different narrative if they tried. It would be one thing if they leaned into him being a morally questionable character who's willing to stoop low to get things done, but in actuality, it's more like somebody tried to write a good guy but accidentally wrote a complete and total dipshit instead, which means that nobody in the story will care about him doing any of this at all because we're supposed to agree with him. The game also paints him as being rather ignorant in a way I don't think they really meant to. In a later chapter of Birthright, it gets brought up how Nor is going through a famine, and Ryoma is surprised at this. But at this point, Ryoma is essentially the king, even if he hasn't officially claimed that title yet. It really begs the question as to how someone who is painted to be this wise and noble leader doesn't even have the most basic knowledge of the countries that border his own, especially one that he's currently at war with. He also doesn't leave much of an impression with his personality either. His equivalent character in Conquest, Xander, has the strength of being naturally charismatic and having a deep relationship with Corrin. Ryoma doesn't have this, and in fact is really boring and dry in all of his dialogue. Speaking of Xander, he is also portrayed as this wise leader type. A pattern that pops up a bit is that the royal families are a little too similar to each other. I don't think this is a huge problem in of itself, it's only in the other ways that Birthright and Conquest mirror each other that I think it doesn't work. But I digress. I think Xander leaves more of an impression on me than Ryoma because of how he leans into this mentor role for Corrin. Like I said, he is a lot more naturally charismatic, and there are a lot more moments where you can see that he genuinely cares about other people. And admittedly, a part of the reason I may have more positive of an opinion on Xander is because for some reason I always seem to unlock more supports when playing Conquest than I do when playing Birthright. Which leads us to the big sticking point for Xander. There is a big discrepancy between how Xander acts in the story and how he acts in his supports. Xander is portrayed in his supports as this very noble and upstanding guy who always has the needs of his people in mind, and I really enjoy this version of the character. He's always empathetic towards others and has a lot of genuinely great depth here. If all of this was just kept consistent during the main story, he'd probably be a fan favorite. But in the main story, he's kind of just dumb as shit. He very often makes decisions that are irresponsible and clueless. Garen being portrayed as this comically evil villain hugely hurts Xander's character. Xander is essentially loyal to Garen above all else, even though Garen is someone who kicks puppies for a living. Xander remains willfully ignorant of this despite being essentially his right-hand man, and then is shocked when the guy who has spent his entire screen time committing war crimes and threatening to execute his own children turns out to be an evil monster. I've heard it said before by some people that he's like this because it's supposed to be some kind of abuse narrative, where people will often go into denial about the situation, especially in a case like this, where because he's next in line for the throne and has essentially been groomed from birth for that very purpose, and is more bound to Garen than anyone else as a result. But while I think this is a genuinely very interesting take on the character, they kind of failed in presenting it, both because they failed to make Garen believable and because they don't ever fully delve into why Xander is so dedicated to him. For a subplot like this to work, it would require a lot more care that just isn't really given. Instead, it all just seems like it's used for the sake of making the plot move along because they needed a reason to make Corrin work with Garen, rather than because it would make sense. He ultimately fails to be sympathetic to a lot of players, even during his suicide by cop in Birthright, due to all of his actions just coming across as irresponsible. Despite this though, and once again at the risk of pissing people off, I don't completely hate Xander. I don't love him, but I definitely don't hate him. He still has plenty of likable moments, and I really love his mentor dynamic with Corrin even outside of the supports. It's really sweet. And the whole perspective I just described could have been really interesting with Xander and the rest of the Norian siblings if they'd only really let that idea flourish. I don't think one can soundly disagree with the fact that he acts differently in the story than he does in supports. I think it would be dishonest of me if I tried to pretend this wasn't the case. But I don't think he's the worst with this either. I think that a lot of people watched that one Fargast video went, yeah, he is inconsistent, and then didn't think any more about the bigger picture and how this same inconsistency affects the rest of the game. And this is not me throwing strays at his Xander video, because he's right. But it's kind of frustrating to see people who watched it refuse to engage with this inconsistency issue beyond what has explicitly been pointed out to them. A lot of characters in Fates deal with this same issue, it just doesn't get talked about nearly as often. Hinoka is the next one to discuss, but like, what the fuck do I even say about her? She's characterized as this tomboyish, somewhat hot-blooded person who's always training, and yet beyond that, There's really nothing here. In Conquest, she's actually one of its most prominent antagonists. Her whole motivation for her entire life up until this point was getting her lost sibling back. This comes to a head in Conquest, where she has to fight and potentially kill the person she spent her whole life training to save one day. And in a vacuum, this should be really cool, but it sadly doesn't exist in a vacuum. Nearly every character in Fates loves Corrin, so this doesn't really stand out as being anything special. In all the other routes, she completely fades into the background. A side effect of her whole motivation being to get Corrin back means that in Birthright, her purpose for doing everything she's done so far has already been achieved, so she just does nothing. She really would have benefited from some kind of secondary motivation to focus on primarily in Birthright. She often goes multiple chapters without a single line of dialogue, despite supposedly being a main character. She has practically no presence at all. She has absolutely no impact on the story in Birthright, and it makes little sense when you consider that her Norian counterpart Camilla has quite a bit of dialogue in Conquest. Apparently the reasoning for this is that Hinoka was actually added into the game in the late stages of development, and the sibling to take her place was supposed to be Corrin themselves, but they wanted to make both families have an even amount of members when excluding Corrin. There's also something else that bothers me about Hinoka, although it isn't specific to her. Hinoka, unlike her brothers, has no legendary weapon. This also applies to all of the princesses, and the only female character in the main cast that can have a legendary weapon is Corrin if she is female. This feels really shitty to me because it's not like it was even decided based on who is the oldest, because Leo and Takumi are younger than Camilla and Hinoka. The legendary weapons are important to the story because they're used to power up the Yato, so doing it this way means the women in the story end up getting completely gimped because it means they're not really necessary for the plot to proceed, which is really sexist, and I absolutely hate it. They don't even escape this criticism in the DLC, because all 4 of the princes have sons only and not daughters, with the odd one out being female Kana, which is a special case anyway in the same way that Corrin is. I wish I could say that this is as sexist as Fire Emblem gets, but have you seen the way Echoes treats women? Jesus roller skating Christ, miss me with that shit. There's also the fact that Nor is established to have its throne passed down to its oldest heir without regard to gender, despite being portrayed broadly as bad, and Hoshido is implied to have a patriarchal succession system, meaning that the throne is passed down to male heirs first, and being portrayed broadly is good. You could argue that part wasn't actually intentional on the part of the writers and just meant to make both kingdoms feel more distinct, and you may have a point, but I can't help but feel that there are like a million other ways to do this, and it just kind of sucks anyways, especially when there's no pushback against these ideas and they're simply accepted uncritically as they are. Hinoka herself even tries to justify this at her coronation, saying that Takumi was a natural leader, even though this trait is entirely informed and never shown to us. This all feels like a case of Hinoka getting overlooked when you consider that her whole thing is how dedicated she is to being a Sky Knight, and how much she cares about her soldiers and gives the vibes of someone who's generally very responsible, even to the point of essentially babysitting her dumbass retainers. And so here, it feels like the game is telling us, yeah, but we think that Hinoka is inherently less capable because, Also, Hinoka's CG cutscene, while not near as bad as Camilla's, still has a panty shot for literally no fucking reason other than to be insulting. And this is in the middle of a very serious cutscene, by the way. In general, it really seems like the female leads are taken less seriously. Elise and Sakura I can kind of excuse since they're both the baby of the group, and in my head that has a little less to do with gender. But Hinoka being essentially cast aside and deemed unimportant, and Camilla's over-sexualization is something I'm a whole lot less willing to give the benefit of the doubt, especially when taking into consideration how the legendary weapons just so happen to be male only. Speaking of sexism, let's talk about Camilla next. Camilla, also known as the writer's barely disguised fetish, might be one of the worst offenders of how all of the characters just revolve around Corrin, if not the worst offender, and she's by far the example of this I hate the most, because she's basically just intended to be walking bait. You probably don't need me to point out to you that her design is over-sexualized, but what's even more disappointing is how she, as a character and as an individual, is no better. She's extremely one-note, and her only real trait is how creepily obsessed she is with Corrin to the point of coming across as predatory. It's one thing to have a well-developed character who happens to have a sexual design, and quite another level of dehumanizing when even their personality and everything else about a character is just meant to be horny. As well, there's a very fine line between a character being shown to embrace their sexuality and a character simply existing to be sexualized to appeal to a certain audience. Her CG cutscene in Birthright is in first person from Corrin's perspective and has her making poses intended to be sexy, complete with hip swaying, while physically smothering Corrin and addressing herself as Corrin's sister. It's just creepy, and there's no way you can soundly argue that she isn't meant to pander to a particular fetish. And this scene is right before you fight her. The other royals all have CG scenes before you fight them intended to look intimidating or at the very least battle ready. Her personality is only ever able to shine when talking about something that isn't Corrin, which if you hadn't guessed, isn't very often. Almost all of her lines that aren't specifically talking to Corrin are still referencing Corrin in some way. It's also super disappointing since she has a cool backstory that they just never go over. Essentially, since Camilla is the daughter of one of the king's concubines and there were a ton of concubines who had a ton of kids, there were originally way more Norian siblings than the ones we see. All of the concubines and their children kept fighting and killing each other for power, so Camilla and the Norian royals we see in-game basically teamed up and murdered all of the concubines, and it kinda explains why Camilla in particular is so fucked up, because she probably killed her own mother and other siblings. But because we apparently aren't allowed to have nice things, this is only ever actually gone over in supplemental material. I'll admit that I find this somewhat odd, beyond just the fact that it's really interesting and tells us a lot about the Norian royals, and that I enjoy stories that talk about trauma and its effects. The whole fighting and killing your family thing is sort of crucial for Fates. In that way, it sort of mirrors what happens during the events of the main story. So it's all the more strange to me that it's never brought up when it could very easily be talked about in this context. Camilla didn't need to be a bad character, someone who's protective and maternal to those she's closest with and cruel and vicious to any who oppose her is a more than decent pitch for a character. But I'd really love it if they explored the concubine wars and how it affected her, give her room to grow and begin to move past it. This could apply to all of the Norian siblings, but I bring it up with Camilla in particular because she absolutely is the one whose mentality is still the most informed by it. She can even still be playful and flirty just as long as it isn't towards the Norian royals or Corrin, or towards the player by extension. She also doesn't need to be so obsessed with protecting Corrin specifically. She has other family members that she had to protect from being killed by the Norian court, so it feels even more odd to me that she focuses specifically on Corrin when Corrin wasn't even exposed to the concubine wars at all. And yes, I know that the term concubine wars sounds goofy as hell. I didn't come up with it, don't look at me. Okay, so I know people will have my head for this opinion, but I'm not gonna sugarcoat it because I'd rather not be dishonest about how I feel. Takumi is a bad person and atrociously written even for Fate standards, and I'm pretty sure the only reason people give him a pass is out of spite for Corrin. I would in fact go so far as to say I have a difficult time imagining a fictional character being more insufferable than this. Before you tell me to drink cyanide in the comments section, allow me to explain my reasoning. Takumi is an asshole, yes, but this isn't always inherently bad so long as it's handled properly. Spoiler alert, it isn't handled properly. Takumi is supposed to be a sort of abrasive, untrusting, and neurotic guy with some pretty big insecurities, and I think what I find most disappointing is that he could have been a much better character than he is. I've been trying to pinpoint why he doesn't work for me, and I've landed on a few reasons for this. First thing being, as I very briefly hinted at before, his relationship with Azura. He is just an unforgivably verbally abusive dickhead to her for no reason, and nobody in the story seems to care. When I talked about Azura, I said that she felt an immediate connection with Corrin, and that what this told me was that Azura wasn't the problem. How this all comes across to me is that Takumi was such a colossal piece of shit to her for such a long amount of time that she stopped trying to be close to the Hoshidan royal family. Him treating Corrin badly at the start is still dickish, but at the very least, I've only known this guy for 5 minutes. But Azura, someone you have quite literally grown up with and who has probably had to deal with you treating her this way every day of her life? Fuck all the way off with that. One might try to argue that it's just a one-time occurrence. She does state at a couple points in Conquest that he doesn't normally act like this. But she's referring to his possession, which took root after the route split off, since he had to fall into the bottomless canyon, which happens after you choose a side. He still acts the exact same way before then during the introduction too. They then confirm in their A and S support together that this has always been the case, even low-key trying to pull the dog shit "I was just bullying you because I liked you" trope in the S support specifically. Yes, I know that S supports aren't canon. It's still gross. And as well, why would the game go out of its way to establish their dynamic in this very specific way if it's just so conveniently not actually the case? Once again, this would mean that what the game tells you and what it shows you are two completely separate things. And forgive me if I'm more inclined to believe what it shows me. And this is also another way the game disrespects its female characters, because she is essentially just expected to be okay with it and immediately forgive him. This shows even more once you realize that the exceedingly rare occasion where Takumi actually gets called out always happens when he's acting this way to Korin specifically. Take, for example, the scene after Makoto dies. This is the only time where the Hoshiden royal family actually seems to have a major problem with this behavior. Just a few minutes earlier, he was telling Azura off for existing next to him, and those same people didn't say a single word about it. He gives a half-assed apology in his A support with her, but it is way too little and too late, and it's a support that the vast majority of players will never see. Something like this needs to be established in the main story and have more than a grand total of 3 lines that isn't in optional side content. This by itself is enough to make me want to fling this F-tier twink into the fucking sun, but he's got other issues too. The first 6 chapters completely fail to show any of his more likable traits, which means that going into the route split, the only thing you have to go off of is all of his worst qualities. In a part of the story where it is the most crucial to get you attached to these characters, so your decision actually means something. In fact, his better traits never show up in the main story at all. There's another huge complaint I have that applies to him in all routes except for Revelation, though it is most certainly not unique to Takumi. Possession is a bad plot device. It just comes across to me as a method to force a character to act in a certain way, regardless of what the character would actually do, to create cheap and manufactured drama. Nothing that someone does while possessed really means anything because they don't have any agency in the situation. And I guess everybody looked at him and decided he was free real estate because he gets mind controlled more often than I stress about my future. In Fates especially though, possession is very poorly defined in how it affects the person, which is also part of the reason I don't buy that it excuses his actions. In Conquest specifically, it almost seemed like they wanted to go for this slow descent into madness, but it fails to stick the landing. Both because they make him too visibly eager to gut you from the beginning in Conquest instead of saving it for later. As a result, there's not any kind of natural progression like there should be, and because he gets interrupted at the last second by the scaly fucker from an alternate dimension. Since he's essentially already a zombie when you fight him as a final boss, the fight loses most of its emotional weight. And whether or not he is logically justified to dislike Korin in Conquest, it doesn't mean his way of expressing it doesn't make him look like someone who yells slurs in the local Walmart. It gets to a point where his personality is so exaggerated he becomes difficult to take seriously. It is absolutely a symptom of bad writing to exaggerate a singular trait that a character has to the point of erasing everything else about them and simplifying them in the process, and that is exactly what happens here. I'd call it Flanderization, but I've only ever heard the term applied to changes in characterization between installments in a series rather than within a single installment, so I'm not sure if it would apply in this case. There is absolutely no subtlety here, and as a result of this extreme exaggeration and simplification in personality, he comes across as immature at his best and a genuinely hateful person at his worst. Whether Korin or Nor deserves it or not is completely irrelevant to this conversation, because it is, at the end of the day, still bad and inconsistent character writing that goes out of its way to piss off the player. He's not too great in Birthright itself either, where he, much like every other Birthright character, has no meaningful presence at all. He just immediately flips from deciding that Korin is Satan incarnate to being fine with them with no period of time in the middle ground, and as a result, he never stands out. He feels just as forgettable in the main story as the rest of the cast. There is no development or build-up here. And the attempt at an arc about his inferiority complex also completely flops when you realize that they frame it inside the same bullshit mind control plotline that Conquest had. Along with this arc having a ton of other issues that I won't be getting into because I'm not covering the plot of Birthright right now. Perhaps you think I'm being too dismissive of him in other routes, but his portrayal in Conquest and during the intro was genuinely so offensively bad to me that it made me never want to look at this guy again. I will give him one very begrudging compliment, and it's that his supports are generally quite good, but sadly not even an iota of his support characterization shows up in the main story. I am not bullshitting when I say that not even one redeeming trait that shows up in his supports shows up in the actual plot. Not a single time. If you just gave me the dialogue for Takumi during his supports and during the main story for Conquest especially, and didn't tell me who was saying that dialogue, I would literally never be able to guess in a million years that they are the same character. And honestly, even Takumi's supports ended up being completely unenjoyable for me because he was so awful during the rest of the game. I know it probably comes across as though I'm overreacting and acting like he shot my family, but he was genuinely one of the worst parts of the game to me. And the thing is, this guy probably wouldn't piss me off as much as he does if he wasn't steeped in constant bad faith arguments for why he's suddenly a good character. I feel like an insane man, because from everything I've seen, people just like him because he hates Corrin, and because people don't like Corrin. If the only reason you like something is out of spite for something else, do you actually like that thing? I hate this argument that he's good because he hates Corrin or the other characters, because it's such an obviously mean-spirited argument towards the rest of the game, and it's also just not constructive in the slightest. It says nothing about Takumi himself or why he's interesting because it only exists due to people's opinions on Corrin. Am I missing something? Am I hallucinating everything that he does in the game to the point where everyone else is seeing a completely different character? Because I truly do not understand. In conclusion, he's inconsistent, lacking in nuance where it matters, irritating, and gets away with way more than he should. It's like he was biochemically engineered in a petri dish to have every trait that I specifically dislike. Okay, let's return to sanity for a second. In very stark contrast, I'll actually say that Leo is probably my favorite character in Fates. I do have some complaints with him. That thing where he kills people for Corrin sometimes is really dumb. This is luckily not anywhere near as intrusive as the problems that most of the other characters have, but it feels sometimes like they only really put him in the game to absorb all of the dirty work for the rest of the protagonists, which is a shame because they learned how to write a decent character for once and then proceeded to not use him. He just gets overshadowed in importance a lot of the time as a result, even if not as much as Hinoka, for example. Since he's kind of intended to be the Norian counterpart to Takumi, the two do have a lot of similarities, namely their inferiority complex and general middle child syndrome, but it's just so much better executed with Leo. He does try a kind of similar thing in Birthright to what Takumi does in Conquest, in that they both put on a show of hating you to hide how hurt they are, but the more scaled back approach and characterization actually makes it make sense in Leo's case. Sadly, this arc in Birthright doesn't actually stand out too much, although that could be said of everything in Birthright, but that's a subject for another day. He never really felt like he was exaggerated or out of character to me. He is much more well-balanced than the rest of the cast. He's noticeably sardonic and judgmental, and even has a bit of a vicious streak, but we also very clearly see from the start that he isn't unreasonably so. He has banter with the other characters sometimes, even if most of it isn't actually that funny, unless someone's collar being inside out is secretly the peak of humor, and is willing to bail out Corrin during the prologue. And say what you will about Leo repeatedly killing people for Corrin throughout the rest of the game, and I won't defend that, cause I think it's kinda stupid too, but I think at the very least during this one segment at the beginning of the game, it was important to establish the Norian royals as willing to look out for each other in the face of their dad being an evil tyrannical Nickelodeon slime man. We need to see the good and bad of the main characters before the branch of fate, so we have something to be invested in when we see that character show up on the opposing side, and Leo does a good job of that. I also think he just plays the role of being an asshole way better than Takumi. This is because the game and cast is a lot more aware of it, and actually shockingly, handles it well. Take, for example, his dynamic with his son Forrest. Leo is, under no uncertain terms, a piece of shit to Forrest, very much playing the role of a queerphobic father not accepting his child. I acknowledge that Forrest is not canonically LGBTQ, but it isn't difficult to make the comparison. You are not intended to agree with Leo. During the course of Forrest's paralogue, Leo actually majorly gets called out for being terrible. He eventually realizes that he's being an awful parent and tries to mend his relationship with his son, making an actual notable change to his behavior towards Forrest. Satisfying character development in my anime titty game? Why did I write that in the script? Something that shows up a lot in Fates is that rarely ever is the game honest about its characters' shortcomings or moral failures. Way too often the game tries to gloss over things in an attempt to ignore it and pretend it wasn't that bad, which tends to just end up feeling gross, or alternatively, they try to hold their characters accountable for a while before backtracking and changing their mind. That last thing in particular is something that shows up a whole lot in Conquest especially. In comparison, Leo's relationship with Forrest stands out to me because this aspect to it still stays relevant. It's not something that the writers just half-assed for the sake of plausible deniability. It has a real and notable effect on their dynamic and gives Leo actual room to grow. It really is like night and day to me when you compare it to the rest of the game. And just generally, most of his supports are good about being aware that he's kind of a dick sometimes. It might be one of the only instances in the game where Fates not only holds its characters accountable through to the end, but actually lets them learn from it. I think it's a shame that he doesn't really do too much in the main story compared to some of the other royals. Although, that may potentially be for the best considering the main plot kinda seems to ruin everything it touches a lot of the time. I guess that leaves the youngest of each family, so Sakura is next, but I honestly don't have much to say about her. She's easily the least interesting of the royals to me besides Hinoka. She's not bad or anything, but she fails to stand out. She doesn't do anything especially wrong, but she doesn't do anything especially right either. She's just middling. She feels really forgotten in her own route, almost as much as Hinoka, I'd argue. But she also doesn't stand out in any of the opposing routes either. She's supposed to be this more innocent, optimistic character somewhat similar to Elise, but doesn't have the advantage Elise does of being able to provide contrast to her countrymen due to how Hoshido as a whole is characterized. And this contrast makes all the difference to me, because this alone means that Elise is providing something that was missing to the Norian cast, whereas Sakura is just kind of redundant. Speaking of Elise, I really like Elise. She's not a particularly deep character, but I think in her case it works to her benefit, precisely because of that aforementioned contrast to the other Norian characters. Since Nor is this rather depressing country where most of its citizens, and by extension, the playable Norian cast as a whole, have a worn, jaded outlook to some degree, her positivity makes her stand out and provides some needed levity in Conquest. In Birthright, she's also the only member of the opposing royal family to actively help you along for a prolonged amount of time, even if some of the others do assist you in some small way every now and then. There's a certain irony I really enjoy in the fact that she is essentially the baby of the group, and yet the only one to work up the courage to directly oppose Garen. An admitted trend is that I'm biased towards Conquest and its protagonists. I wasn't exactly trying to pretend I wasn't biased. This is not supposed to be the almighty voice of reason coming down from the heavens, telling you what is objectively the correct opinion to have. All of this is highly subjective. But, for me personally, I found the Norian royal family to be much more engaging and likable than the Hoshidan royal family. I'm gonna move on to the last character I'll be covering. Let's talk about Makoto. Makoto is someone that is never explained at all. She can raise magical barriers around an entire country and foretell the future. Why? Because fuck you, that's why. It is sort of implied that this is passed down through blood, since the tutorial map seems to imply Korin somehow has the same ability to see the future, even if I absolutely hate that implication. But where did it come from in the first place, and are there any other people that can also do this? Makoto is so transparently a walking plot device because of convenience instead of believability. Her only personality trait is that she's perfect in every way, and the contrast in characterization between her and Garen is a microcosm of everything that is wrong with the conflict between Nor and Hoshido. As well, if you make a character too obviously perfect in every way, it's just going to have the opposite effect and make them kind of annoying. It's even to the point that when she's introduced, they put a holy light around her. This sounds, when I say it, like the game is trying to be funny, but it is completely dead serious. She's also not the biological mother of the Hoshiden siblings, only being related to Korin, with the character named Hikona being the biological parent of the others. Except that Korin is a middle child, so this just feels nonsensical and strange in its implications. There's no logical reason Korin shouldn't at least be related to Takumi and Sakura, who are both younger than Korin, at least until you play the DLC, I guess. I bring this up now because it ties into the most infamous aspect of Makoto's character. If you booted up Birthright and went into the support menu, something you might see that will set off some serious alarm bells is an S-support option between Korin and their supposed siblings. Maybe you think to yourself that it must be a rare platonic S-support, or you become morbidly curious, or you want to ignore the potential incest part because you like the character, or maybe you're just fucking weird. But either way, if you go through with it and decide you want to S-support any of the siblings, during the resulting scene, the sibling in question, with the exception of Ryoma, will tell Korin they received a letter from Makoto before her death, but was told to not open it until they fell in love with someone. And the letter tells them that they aren't actually related. Approximately 50% of Makoto's inclusion in the game is an incest excuse. The game never tells you this before the S-support, by the way, so you have to manually choose it while still under the assumption that they're related. I don't think I need to specify this, but characters are the most important part of any story, because if I don't give a shit about these people, why would I care about what they do or what happens to them? Your audience immediately tunes out because you fail to give them a reason to care. And yet, nearly every major character in the game runs into at least one or multiple massive issues that together ultimately damn its cast to unlikability and eventually apathy. Of course, if you like these characters, I'm not trying to stop you or make you feel bad for it, and if you feel offended by me saying I don't like them, just remember that this is all coming from someone who feels the need to make a several-part video series about a decade-old anime game that probably no one cares about anymore because I have no life. Even if I do take issue with a certain argument used for or against an aspect of the game, I do not have an issue with people simply feeling the way they do about it. No, I'm not talking about every single recruitable character, because that's pointless. Ah yes, who could forget the most important character in the game, Ignatius, who everyone most certainly very vividly remembered. I'll be honest with you, I don't actually have an outro planned because my original script just went straight into the next part and I'm too lazy to write a new one, so here's my outro, right here, right now.